Welcome to Vent with Michelle Malkin. On the front burner today, exposing ambulance fraud. What kind of sicko do you have to be to use an ambulance as a killing aid or propaganda tool? Well, Islamic terrorists in the Middle East have a long history of using emergency vehicles as tools of their murderous trade, and international charities and media dupes have gone along for the ride. Today, we take an in-depth look at the ambulances for terror ploy that the rest of the mainstream media has chosen to ignore. In March 2002, Israeli Defense Forces discovered a bomb in a Palestine Red Crescent Society ambulance near Jerusalem. The bomb, packed in a suicide belt, was hidden under a gurney carrying a Palestinian child. The driver confessed that it was not the first time ambulances had been used to ferry explosives. Female suicide bomber Wafa Idris, who blew herself up in a January 2002 attack in Jerusalem, was a medical secretary for the PRCS. Her recruiter was an ambulance driver for the same organization, which receives support from governments worldwide and the American and International Red Cross. In May 2004, an Israeli television station aired footage of armed Arab terrorists in southern Gaza using an ambulance owned and operated by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, which has received more than $2.5 billion in American taxpayer subsidies. Palestinian gunmen used the UN emergency vehicle as getaway transportation after murdering 6 Israeli soldiers. Peter Hansen, the head of the UN Relief and Works Agency, huffily denied that its vehicles were being exploited by terrorists. But a few months later, he told Canada's CBC TV, quote, "I am sure that there are Hamas members on the UNRWA payroll, and I don't see that as a crime."
Hamas as a political organization does not mean that every member is a militant, and we do not do political vetting and exclude people from one persuasion as against another.
Senior UNRWA employee Nahed Rashid Ahmed Attallah confessed to using his official UN vehicle to bypass security and smuggle arms, explosives, and terrorists to and from attacks. He was in charge of distributing food supplies to Palestinian refugees. Nidal Abid Al-Fattah Abdullah Nizal, a Hamas activist, worked as a UNRWA ambulance driver and admitted he too had used an emergency vehicle to transport munitions to terrorists. When they're not being used to ferry weapons, ambulances serve as a major stage prop for Hezbollah news productions. Don't take my word for it. Listen to CNN's Anderson Cooper.
On the Hezbollah side, it's really interesting. I was in Beirut, and they took me on this sort of guided tour of the Hezbollah-controlled territories in southern Lebanon that were heavily bombed. They're much cruder. Obviously, they don't have the experience in this kind of thing, but they clearly want the story of civilian casualties out. That is their what they are heavily pushing, to the point where on this tour I was on, they were just making stuff up. They had 6 ambulances lined up in a row and said, okay, they brought reporters there. They said, you can talk to the ambulance drivers. And then one by one, they told the ambulances to turn on their sirens and to zoom off. And people taking that picture, would be reporting, I guess, the idea that, these ambulances were zooming off to treat civilian casualties, when in fact, these ambulances were literally going back and forth down the street just for people to take pictures.
Keep all this context in mind, and keep the summer's bombshell blog revelations of widespread war photography in mind as well, as we move on to the events of July 23rd of this year. According to the Lebanon Red Cross, 2 of its ambulances were deliberately struck by weapons in Qana, Lebanon, while performing rescue missions. The international press, which has stubbornly ignored the prolonged exploitation of emergency vehicles by terrorists, went ape over the claims. They immediately suggested that Israel had deliberately targeted the vehicles. A hysterical report by ITV was typical. And note that the reporter was not at the scene, but relied on video of a local amateur cameraman and swallowed the ambulance driver's stories whole.
The ambulances were hit at around midnight last night as their crews transferred wounded civilians from one vehicle to another in a village east of Tyre.
We never intentionally target civilians or ambulances.
It's noticeable that one burst of fire struck the exact center of the cross on the roof of one of the ambulances.
We never intentionally target civilians or ambulances.
Because of the extreme dangers of the roads, journalists have not visited the scene. These pictures were taken by a local amateur cameraman.
Photos and accounts of the alleged ambulance targeting were disseminated widely by news wires, the BBC, the New York Times, and countless other media organizations. But bloggers have again raised pointed questions about what those photos really show. Internet investigator Zombie broke down the allegations in a massive online report last week. It was mentioned by Fox News' Brit Hume, but was otherwise ignored by the mainstream media. Here, for the lazy editors and ombudsmen who don't want to do their own homework, are the main claims and doubts raised. Claim number 1. An Israeli missile pierced the exact center of the Red Cross on the roof of one ambulance. Take a good look at this ambulance. Time magazine echoed ITV News in reporting that, quote, a missile punched through the roof of the vehicle and exploded inside, unquote. So did the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and NBC News. But is it true? The neat hole punched dead center in the middle of the roof is in exactly the same location that ventilation holes of other ambulances are positioned. Moreover, a missile explosion inside an ambulance would not leave the rest of the vehicle as intact as the supposedly targeted ambulance remained. These are photos of what really happens when Israeli missiles explode inside vehicles. Claim number 2. The attack happened on July 23rd. Look at the rust on the roof. I mean, look at it. Have Israelis found a secret ingredient to add to their missiles to make targets rust upon impact? To many bloggers, it appears obvious. The damage to the ambulance roof took place long before the date of the alleged Israeli strike. Claims number 3 and number 4. There was a huge explosion and intense fire inside the ambulance depicted here. Several media outlets, including Time and the Boston Globe, quoted ambulance driver Qasim Shalan describing a, quote, big boom, unquote, and big fire inside the vehicle. Well, look inside. The gurneys and seats are intact and barely damaged at all. Remember what missile explosions inside vehicles really look like. This does not belong. So, what do the media outlets who inveighed against the alleged Red Cross ambulance strike last month have to say about the questions and doubts over the incident? It's the same response they've had to the jihadis' past ambulance hoaxes. Nothing. We will continue to push for accountability. You can help by spreading the word and sending this episode to your favorite print or TV news outlet for response, and to your political representatives. Many of the UN and Red Cross ambulances and ambulance drivers being exploited by the likes of Hamas and Hezbollah are supported by American taxpayers and charitable groups. It is time to cut off the Ambulances for Terror lifeline. Till next vent, I'm Michelle Malkin for Hot Air.